Hello and welcome to this lesson for higher biology, which today is looking at speciation. So this follows on from our last lesson on evolution, and what we're going to be looking at is how new species are going to arise as a result of evolution. So what you need to be able to do is explain what's meant by the terms species and speciation. You need to be able to state the importance of isolation barriers in speciation, and you need to be able to describe the difference between allopatric and sympatric speciation. So when we talk about speciation, what we're really referring to is the formation of a new biological species, and that's brought about by evolutionary change. You should know from National 5 that a species is any group of organisms which can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. And the key, as always, is the fertile offspring in there. If the offspring produced by the breeding are not fertile, then the two parental members are not, in fact, of the same species. So speciation is where we have the formation of two new species. There are two main types of speciation, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And allopatric is the type that you would have learned about predominantly at National 5, and that's when we have the gene flow is between our two populations of the same species is prevented by some kind of geographical barrier. So it's a geographical isolation, and each population of that species go on to try and fill different niches. So your geographical barriers could be a few different types. You could have a river, sea, desert, mountain ranges, any kind of geographical barrier which is preventing the flow of genes from part of a population to another part of a population. So the process by which this takes place begins with a large population of interbreeding individuals of one species. So here we've got our little group of aliens, and they are all one large interbreeding population. Now, for simplicity, obviously in the diagram we've made them identical, however you would be aware that normally in any population you've got some kind of variation occurring, so there would be a few differences between them. For allopatric speciation to occur, we then have some kind of barrier separating the populations into two isolated subpopulations. So in this case we've got a mountain range. So if you were to imagine that billions of years ago, as the Earth was being formed, for example, you may have had an earthquake causing mountain ranges or areas to start growing up, and that may have eventually over time separated our populations into either side. So it's the same group as before, just one are on one side of the mountain, one are on the other side of the mountain. And that really stops any breeding between these two populations. There is no need for any individual on this side to cross over to that side, or vice versa. They have everything they need on either side. So our random mutations, which would normally occur to give rise to some variation within a group, are going to occur, and because our subpopulations are a little bit different, we've got some random mutations occurring on this side, some random mutations occurring on this side. What then happens is that we wind up with a little bit of different selection pressures happening. So in this side we maybe some of the food type dies out, so we've got a slight change in the food type. And on this side we've wound up with a different climate happening. And this allows natural selection to take place. So in this case, our little guy with the two fingers having the whole hand is finding it easier to get to our new food source, and our change in climate, the blue skin over here, is going to help him survive the cold. So that allows that natural selection to take place, and these individuals that are more able to survive and breed and pass on their genes to the next generation, are going to be able to do that. So these useful DNA mutations are going to get passed on to the next generation. So over a very long time, those last few stages, so mutations occurring, the different selection pressures having an impact in natural selection taking, are going to cause those two gene pools to become so altered that they're now genetically distinct and isolated. So we're not talking just about our changes to finger type and our changes to skin colour. They've altered over time to have so many different mutations from each other that the DNA is very distinct from each other. That means if we were to remove the original barrier, these two subpopulations wouldn't be able to interbreed anymore. So they are now two separate, distinct species. Now something similar will happen in sympatric speciation, and that's really when two or more populations are going to live in close proximity to each other, but they still become genetically isolated. And this happens due to a behavioural or an ecological barrier. So in this case, if we look at this one, we've got our two groups of fruit flies here, and both eating, feeding off red apples. However, this group make a change and start feeding on green apples. So eventually they just don't come across each other anymore and become a genetically distinct group from each other. To talk you through that a little bit more slowly, so we have our large interbreeding population sharing the same ecological niche. And just imagine for now that each one of these little blue dots is a fruit fly. There was no chance of us making up thousands and thousands of fruit fly pictures on here, so imagine our little blue dots is a fruit fly, and it's living on these hawthorn bushes. Let's see. So let's say we've got a hawthorn bush, and they're living on those quite happily. However, a new ecological niche is brought into the environment. So, for example, let's say this yellow circle here is an apple tree which has been brought in by some humans. So humans have come into this area and planted an apple tree. So some members of our fruit fly population decide that they're going to exploit that new niche, so there's less competition around them. They don't need to look amongst all of these for food, etc. So they decide to exploit our new apple tree that we've got available to them. So as a result, we have our two populations exploiting different resources. And they're no longer interbreeding. So just naturally, these guys are just going to breed with each other because they're all next to each other on the apple tree. These guys are going to be breeding with each other because they're all sitting next to each other on the hawthorn tree. So we then wind up perhaps with some mutations arising in our different populations. And perhaps this one here means they're better camouflaged on apples. So that becomes a useful traits to have, therefore natural selection is going to occur in favour of new mutants. So over a period of time, most of the organisms on our apple tree are going to have that particular camouflage, and again, because they're not breeding with these guys over here, these guys aren't breeding with them, there's no chance of passing that on to the others. So over a long period of time, we again wind up with our two genetically distinct species, and they can no longer interbreed to produce our fertile offspring. So that's what we mean when we refer to sympatric speciation. It's essentially the same process that's happening, it's just the barrier that's different. It's either behavioural or ecological. So from that, you should be able to explain what is meant by a species and speciation, state why isolation barriers are important, and describe what is meant by allopatric and sympatric speciation and the differences between them.